Today, I have the fortune to speak to Dr. Anna Salter. She is a clinical psychologist from Harvard University. She has obtained a master's degree in child study at Tufts University. She has given several talks about child abuse in 50 states and in 10 countries. She is the author of several books. One of them is Predators, which is the book that I would like to talk about today. Thank you for accepting the interview, Dr. Salter.
Thank you very much for having me.
First of all, I would like to start by asking you how you ended up working in this field. I read on your book that it was quite unexpected that you were studying at Harvard and you just had one lecture about child abuse, but there weren't lectures about the mindset, the profile of a child offender. And besides that, you mentioned that when you were working in a mental center, you were astonished because there were two-thirds of children who had been victims of child abuse. My question is, what was the turning point in which you resolved to be focused on this topic?
I was a student and a teaching fellow at Harvard. I was getting my PhD, and we had lectures on all kinds of topics. Some things that were so rare that I've never seen them in 40 years of practice, but nothing really on child abuse. No courses, nothing. And that certainly wasn't just Harvard. That was the state of psychology in my country at that time. There was a pervasive silence. And if you were told anything about child abuse, you were told that incest was a 1 in a million thing. But I came along just as the silence was starting to be broken. A few initial books came out about child abuse, and victims were just starting to speak up. I still didn't understand how pervasive the problem was until I worked in a community mental health center, and children, it seemed that 50% of the children had been physically, emotionally, or sexually abused. It's all I saw. And then the court started sending sex offenders. And if I didn't know anything about victims, I certainly didn't know anything about sex offenders. So I decided to learn. And I got a grant, went around the country, and began looking at places that treated sex offenders. I found one, spent considerable time there, and ended up writing up that program with their permission. And it was one of the early books. It was called Treating Child Sex Offenders and Victims, a Practical Guide. It went all over the place, I think mainly because there weren't a lot of other books about sex offenders out there.
Okay. What were basically the limitations that you had? Because I've read that when it comes to child abuse, most child offenders, those who are studied, have been convicted of these actions. Because I guess that there are pedophiles who have these attractions but don't materialize it. Is this a limitation regarding the research up to now?
We can only study either detected child sex offenders or sex offenders who volunteer for treatment, but they are very, very rare. So you're very correct. The population that we have information about is the population of child sex offenders who have typically been arrested, at least arrested, but most often arrested, charged, and convicted, and either sent to prison or sent to outpatient treatment by the courts.
Okay. On your book, I was astonished to read that most sex offenders, before being arrested, they have committed between 50 and 100. They have had between 50 and 150 victims, and that's really heartbreaking. And of course, there are certain individual sex offenders who have abused more. And that was something that it's really shocking, this situation.
The studies on victims show that only about 15% of victims report abuse. I don't know the figures for Peru. That figure is based on a 5-country study of the US, Australia, England, and 2 other Western countries. But I doubt it's much better anywhere. Victims are embarrassed, they're ashamed, they feel like they'll be blamed, they feel like they won't be believed. The courts in my country are not very friendly to victims. They have to confront even very young children are supposed to be able to confront their adult abusers in court. And as a result, very few, only about 15% report. So think of all the 85% of offenses that offenders get away with.
Right,
And
right.
they get away with more than that because only about a third don't even go to prosecutors. Police screen them out because they think they aren't valid. So really, only 1 to 2% of offenders are actually convicted.
Contrary to common belief, though those sex abusers capitalize on victims' vulnerabilities, and they belong to the social circle of the victim, because it's easy to think that perhaps they turn to violence. But that's one of the first shocking things that I read, that they develop a friendship with the parents in order to manage to be with the kids. So it's incredible that it's 90% who are part of the social circle of the victim, right?
Well, either the social circle or they
Mm,
are a teacher, a
mm,
music teacher, a psychologist, a doctor, someone that the child, often
mm.
someone who is in a position of authority over the child, could be a relative, could be an acquaintance from any social group that they happen to know.
You emphasized quite a lot that we have several biases. That's why we are vulnerable. And when we address this topic of child abuse, we have to be especially aware of that. Perhaps one which is on the top is that we tend to associate a child molester with a monster, and we tend to confuse. We assume that niceness is a personality trait, when in reality it could be as a strategy of interaction in order to take advantage of someone. And that was for me really, really shocking, because I have been working in a prison and I discovered the same, that I was surrounded by child offenders, and they were incredibly charming, charismatic, and very treatable. So I remember that that was a turning point for me somehow regarding this issue, that wow, it's it's unbelievable.
The, the offenders with who are the most successful in securing large numbers of victims are very likable. Gavin de Becker wrote in his book, niceness is a decision, not a character trait. And I joke that if I ever get a tattoo, I'm going to tattoo that on my forehead. Niceness is a decision, not a character trait. But it's true. These are wolves wearing sheep's clothing. They are acting like genuinely likable, nice people. And our problem is we think we can tell the difference in the fakes and the people who are genuinely nice. But there is a ton of research out there that shows we cannot tell who is lying to us.
That's right. That's one of the vices we're going to talk about later. They lead a double life. That's right. And when it comes to the profile, uh, I've been doing research about these individuals, and there are even Nobel Prize winners who have abused
Yes.
children. So it's not just confined to a precarious sector of society. We could
Right.
find pedophiles wherever or where there are children. Is that right?
Yes, that's definitely right. We tend to think they are people who are living under bridges. Those kind of people get convicted more than college presidents, but we've had offenders who are college presidents, Nobel Prize winners, celebrities of all types, politicians. A person's job has nothing to do with whether or not they're sexually attracted to children.
All right. And now, when it comes to the academic literature, we tend to think that they are born this way, right? That it's congenital, this sexual attraction towards children.
There is some evidence that there may be a genetic component. The truth is, none of us choose who we're attracted to. We grow up, and as teenagers, we discover whether we're attracted to the same sex or the opposite sex. In the same manner, many of these guys discover that they're attracted to kids. I don't hold offenders accountable for who they're attracted to. I consider pedophilia an affliction, but I hold them responsible for their behavior. People are attracted to inappropriate sex partners all the time. You might be attracted to your wife's sister. That doesn't mean you're going to do anything inappropriate, because you have decision-making power over your behavior, not over whether you find her attractive or not. The same thing is true of pedophiles. They have control over their behavior. They just can't help who that they are attracted to.
Okay, so there's a world of difference between having an attraction or even a predisposition and acting on them. That's rather different. So it's
Yes,
important.
one is a sexual interest or orientation, and the other is a crime.
But do you consider that it might be possible that someone might turn into a pedophile or develop this attraction?
Well, there is some question about that, because there have been, I'm thinking of one particular study of female offenders, and many of them got talked into offending by a male co-offender, but eventually they became sensitized to sex with children, and some of them started offending on their own. So the problem is, if you pair orgasm with anything, it's a powerful reinforcer. So there is a possibility that if you, for example, watched enough child pornography and kept masturbating to it, you could sensitize yourself to sex with children. But why would you do that
That's
if
right.
you weren't already attracted to kids? It
Yeah.
would be a very stupid thing to do.
On your book, you mentioned that their Achilles heel is that they are narcissistic. And when I was talking to child offenders, several of them told me that they started seeing children as challenges. And I wonder, why do you consider that they are narcissistic? They have this personality trait.
No, I don't believe that
Mm,
pedophiles
mm,
are necessarily narcissistic. I believe that psychopaths, people who
mm.
don't have a conscience, are narcissistic. Uh, but psychopaths can be sex offenders, but not necessarily. In my country, Bernie Madoff was a stockbroker who stole billions of dollars from people who invested with him. And he certainly appeared to have a lot of psychopathic traits, but he certainly wasn't interested in kids. Psychopaths do whatever they want to do. They don't care about other people's feelings or their rights or anything else, but only a percentage of them are attracted to kids. And there are many pedophiles who are not narcissistic. They're afraid of adult women. They feel insecure about themselves. They believe that they can control children, whereas they can't control adults. So pedophiles aren't necessarily narcissistic, but psychopaths typically are.
Okay, they perpetrate these acts uh, to a certain extent. It's still mysterious because they have fear of intimacy with adults. They could have uh,
Some of them.
um, and of course they might have this attraction. But I read that you highlighted that a minority of victims confessed for several reasons. One is that they cannot make a sense of this situation. They feel shame and guilt because, in principle, they say, okay, this person is quite close to my father or my mother, and they have a good relationship, so it's inconceivable that they might harm or inflict pain on me. So how could we foster or raise awareness about this situation so that people who are victims might take initiatives to report these situations?
Well, at least in the US, the treatment of victims in court is one reason that children do not report, because they are cross-examined. They have to face their accusers. The court takes no account of the power differential between a 7-year-old girl and an adult male. So I do believe that legal reforms can help. I also believe that school programs that talk about sexual abuse and how it can be someone close to you, but if anyone touches you in a place the bathing suit covers, then you should report it. Some of the kids who are afraid to report to their mothers will report to police. I do think that there are books on sexual abuse for even preschool children, where again, you can talk about secret touching. And if anybody touches you in a way that makes you uncomfortable and tells you not to tell, then you should tell. I think parents should read those books to their kids and say, you can tell me anything. I'm not going to blame you if something ever happens. And you don't have to be graphic with small children to say this. If somebody touches you in a way that you don't like, well, they could talk about the kid at school punching them in the nose, and that's fine. But you don't have to be graphic, but there are ways to talk to children about sexual abuse. I also believe that parents need to stay in their kids' lives and attend their extracurricular activities. I was a parental liaison or an assistant coach for practically every soccer, baseball, and basketball team my kids participated in. I went to the practices. I didn't just hand my kids over to somebody who was a coach and assumed he was legitimate. Yes, 99% of them will be legitimate, but the chances that your child will run across a molester at some point in their childhood are not small.
Okay. And regarding the topic of the effects of child abuse, on the one hand, there are those scholars who claim that our brains are quite plastic, therefore it's possible to recover. There are those who talk about something called post-traumatic growth. After a traumatic experience, it's possible to develop resilience. And there are studies showing that several university students were victims of a sort of child abuse, but there were no effects in their lives. And on the other hand, there are those who claim uh, that it's very hard to recover. But there is one statement that caught my attention about a book. You said that being a victim of child abuse is like being bitten by a rattlesnake. Certain children could fully recover, others not, but which is out of the question is that it's truly detrimental. So, what's your perspective about the effects of child abuse? Do you think that our society is aware of this, that they tend to minimize it?
The biggest predictor of whether a child recovers from child sexual abuse is the family. And when the abuse is incestuous, for example, a father, the biggest predictor is the mother. So yes, I do believe that child abuse is a terrific, horrific stressor on children. And I do believe that some children recover, particularly especially those who have supportive parents or a supportive mom, or who have relatives who believe them and support them. But on the other hand, not all children are in that situation. And many children don't recover and carry the depression, anxiety, PTSD all their lives.
Um, okay, and you have a couple of books about this topic. What's the best way to address this situation? Those people who have serious effects after being victims of child abuse.
I used to work with victims until I kind of got drawn more into this sex offender field. And I put out a book called Transforming Trauma, which it is by Sage Publications, and that is about this whole issue of how victims heal. And I have some thoughts for therapists in there too. For example, I believe that a lot of therapists think all they have to do is say to a victim, it's not your fault. And it certainly isn't their fault. But sometimes that frightens victims, because if there's nothing they can do differently, they think they could be assaulted again. So it's more complicated than just saying to people, oh, it's not your fault, right? I tell therapists and family members, never say, just move on, just move on. If you've lost your ability to trust, how do you just move on? How do you work or live in a world where you're afraid your boss is going to assault you, or your best friend's brother, or you just have lost your confidence that you can tell who's safe or who isn't? There's a lot of new therapies out that focus on calming down the brain. And I definitely believe in that. I believe that the amygdala can get kind of permanently stuck in a lights on position, in an alarm position, where people have a hyper startle. If someone comes up behind them, they jump way more than someone who hadn't been abused would jump. I believe that in somatic therapies and yoga, I definitely believe in meditation. I don't think that psychotherapy alone, talking about it, is the entire answer. I also think that we need things like meditation to help calm that part of the brain out that's always on red alert.
When we talk about